Hello everyone, and welcome to something new. Thus far on the channel, we have had a great time moving our little tanks around the map, playing our Fistful of Toes wargaming campaign. However, it's a new year, and I've decided to start something new. And we are taking a lot of new steps all at once. First of all, we're going to wind the clock of our fictional South America forward to the year 1984. Second, we are going to shift from the land on the eastern side of the continent to the high seas of the eastern Pacific. Tanks are going to take a back seat. Naval warfare is going to come to the front, which is going to mean not only a new time and a new setting and a new scenario, but we are also going to introduce a new set of rules to base our campaign on. The scenario is two countries, Odontos, which occupies the western area of the continent here, and Placata, which occupies this section of Central America up here, have had a long-standing feud over the Galapagos Islands. Odontos nominally controls and occupies the territory, but in January of 1984, the Placatans decide, as a political move in order to stir up support among their base, that they are going to reach south here and conquer the islands and take them back once and for all. That conflict is going to be the core of our scenario, and we are going to play out an air-sea battle in the eastern Pacific here. Now let's get into a bit more of the specifics about how that will be done. The tactical layer of our campaign will be handled using the Harpoon wargaming rules. This covers radars, missiles, guns, damage control, fires, flooding, anti-ship missiles, all the good stuff that we need in order to wargame on the seas in this era. If any land conflicts arise, we will revert back to Fistful of Toes for those and just kind of cross-convert units as needed. But first, let's look at the big picture. How are we going to evaluate, before we get into our little ship-on-ship fights, how do we manage the entire operation? I've come up with a framework that I think is going to be a sound basis for running a campaign, rolling in a few of the lessons learned from the Kolgos campaign. So, this is a campaign of aggression. Placata, up here, is going to start things. Once they do so, Odontos is going to respond 1 to 6 hours later. Aircraft are, of course, going to be the quickest and most responsive, given that many of them are probably on some kind of alert status. And 24 hours after the initial aggression, the Odontos fleet in their port down here in Guayaquil will deploy. The basic framework is this. Placata, the aggressor, will either launch their fleet out of port or launch some kind of airstrike early in the morning on the 11th of January. Not at midnight exactly, but that's when the campaign timekeeping is going to start. As soon as this launch occurs, Odontos spies are going to note it and communicate it, and then 1 to 6 hours later, we can start changing alert statuses at bases, we can start shuffling ground troops in near proximity, and we can direct aircraft to do things. But it will be 24 hours later that the ships of the Odontos Navy are actually able to leave their port down here in Guayaquil. Moving forward into the game, we're going to try to keep things blocked into 6-hour operational turns. We're going to assume not everything is running at top efficiency. So Fleet orders are probably going to happen by the 6-hour block. Each Air Force is going to be able to only package a certain set of planes into one airstrike or air mission per 6-hour block. Same thing with anti-submarine patrols and reconnaissance patrols. We're also going to assume that most intelligence is disseminated at the end of the turn. I think this is going to be important to allow us to slightly compartmentalize the operation, because although this is a large chunk of the world we're looking at here, 200 nautical miles to the inch, as I measured it, we're within 1,000 nautical miles of everything at all times, meaning that if we have multiple little things going on and we want to try to simulate some commander attempting to respond and manage strategy based on all of those at the same time, things are going to get pretty hairy. So I'm hoping that we can block things out into these turns and separate parallel operations just a little bit. Ships must detach from the main fleet for a full turn to replenish. Each fleet has a certain number of supply ships available, and those supply ships may or may not become critical. It depends how long the campaign lasts and what kind of munition expenditures we see. But gone for a full turn, and I noted down here that it takes 15 minutes to do kind of an emergency refueling stop. That's if somehow the location of the supply ship and accompanying vessels gets tracked down and they're subject to an air raid or something. I don't really expect that to come up. The end of the game. Obviously, the winner is whoever has the islands at the end of the game. There's two end conditions, either one. Total financial loss. I have a big spreadsheet with the cost of every piece of equipment that we're going to discuss today. I set different thresholds. Placata, the aggressor, is trying to usurp the status quo. They have some kind of internal political tensions. Their threshold is lower than Odontos, who sees this as their territory. They're going to be attacked with an underhanded blow, which tends to kind of consolidate the civilian populace around a cause. So their loss threshold is much higher. And I think this is actually close to the total value of all of their forces. Though I did note at the bottom here, ships lost with all hands count double. Now we'll assume lost with all hands if there is no surviving accompanying vessel. And if a surviving accompanying vessel is on scene, then that vessel has to get to a port ASAP to discharge the hundreds of survivors on board. Second condition, if we've gone 10 days and somehow these forces are both still reasonably intact, there's just a 2 in 6 chance per day of international pressure halting the war. So there is a time limit. Placata must get onto the island and drive the Odontons off inside 10 days, or there's a chance that they started the war for nothing. Finally, two little kind of niche scenario rules: weather and satellites. Now, I've been checking the weather forecasts for this area of the world, trying to keep up on that, as well as dig into some historical data. And really, the weather never gets that bad here. If you think of the tropics in the Pacific as more or less paradise, this is that. Minus the typhoons and monsoons, it's pretty peaceful almost all of the time. So, got to make a note here. 5 out of every 6 days, we have good weather. Sea state 2, 100% visibility. That's what the forecasts tend to line up with. 1 out of every 6 days, we have a sea state of 4, which is enough to affect ship operations and submarine operations. And we have 60% visibility. These numbers are important because though this is the 1980s, these are forces on a budget, which means radar is not universal to all platforms. Infrared is not universal to all platforms. So there will be a good bit of visual searching going on. Since it's the 1980s, I'm assuming that both sides know the forecast 3 days out, which I am going to grab a die, and we're going to go ahead and roll for that right now. All right. The weather on the 11th will be good. For context, a 1 would be bad. Oh, like that. So it's going to get worse tomorrow. And then clear up. So without delving too deep into the intricacies of the equipment, the 11th, will be a fine day for almost everyone except the submarines. It will be a very bad day for the submarines. Low speed state, high visibility. It's going to make things very difficult for them. If the submarines are going to get any hunting done in the early stage of the campaign, it's probably going to have to happen on the 12th, when the choppier seas are going to degrade the sonar ability of the surface forces. And finally, just to emphasize that we are in a more modern period, satellite intelligence. At noon each day, roll a d10 for each fleet. 1 in 10 chance that they are spotted by an enemy satellite. Now, if the day is bad weather, like the 12th, we will roll that visibility chance to determine whether the fleet is actually seen by the camera on the satellite. I don't expect this to have a huge impact, but it is worth acknowledging that this is a capability at the time that certainly very large, rich countries had, but also there were just a lot of satellites around, and I'm assuming that some of this spotting, quote unquote, is acquiring satellite imagery, hints, and like diplomatic messaging from third parties that we don't really want to model into the campaign. With the scenario structured, let's talk about the forces that are going to be fighting with it. Feast your eyes on this quality map here, because for the orders of battle, I did my crudest representation of Western South America here. Now, this is Odontos, the defenders, the holders of the island. I'm going to run through their fleets and air forces real quick. I'm not going to get into munitions. We'll cover that in a future video. I just want to give you an idea of what we're working with. Their main fleet, here in their home port, has 1 battleship, 1 heavy cruiser, 1 landing platform helicopter. Think like a mini aircraft carrier with helicopters full of angry Marines. And they have 1 destroyer escort with guided missiles. They have 3 traditional destroyers, you could say, all-gun destroyers, and a patrol boat available. They have naval forces permanently stationed at the island. 1 of those classic all-gun destroyers, and 3 smaller patrol gunboats. Air forces on the mainland. I cut the aircraft numbers down a little bit, as you can see here, because I did want this to remain a naval wargame. F-16As, 6 of them. 4 F-4Es, that's the fighter contingent there. 2 A-6E intruders. 6 AV-8 Harriers. Those are VTOL jets, or STOVL jets, able to land vertically and take off on very short runways, which means those are capable of operating from this landing platform helicopter over here. They have 1 RV-1 recon plane, 1 S-3 anti-submarine, and Sea Recon plane, 10 UH-1 general utility helicopters, 5 medium lift helicopters, a C-130 cargo plane, and a KC-130 aerial refueler. Stationed out at the island at the start of the scenario, we have 2 F-16s, 2 F-4s, 2 A-6s, an RV-1, and an S-3. Also out at the island of note, there is a improved Hawk surface-to-air missile battery for airfield defense, and there is a battery of Styx anti-ship missiles. 1 launcher, 4 available missiles. Those will put a destroyer down pretty well and put a reasonable dent in anything much larger. So those will be important to the defense of the island. Let's see if I missed anything. Oh, the other important things. Spread across the fleet, they have 7 SH-2 helicopters for scouting and submarine patrol. And they have 2 supply ships to support operations. Their land forces, they have 2 marine amphibious units, one of which is in reserve. They have a unit of light armored vehicles in reserve, and they have an engineering company. One of the amphibious units and an engineering company are on board the LPH. It's only able to offload heavy vehicles port side, and this amphibious unit has a lot of jeeps, since those can be helicopter lifted. At the crisis flashpoint, we have already on the island 1 rifle company, 1 tow team, 2 Stinger teams, and a platoon of, this is VADS, Vulcan Air Defense System. It's a 20mm cannon and fire control radar mounted on top of a small APC. It's the American equivalent to a Shilka or Tunguska, if you recognize those Russian terms. So, that's Odontos. Let's move on to Placata. Now, Placata will start the scenario with some good advantages befitting their role as aggressor. First of all, you may see here, their fleet is substantially larger. Their capital ship is a BBH, battleship helicopter. This is based on a fictional adaptation of the USS Iowa that was never made. It's 1/2 battleship and 1/2 helicopter landing ship. They have a guided missile cruiser, packing missiles with a range of, I think about 80 miles. They have 2 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers with guided missiles, and these guided missiles have a longer range than the destroyer escort's guided missiles. They have 2 destroyer escorts, 4 classic all-gun destroyers, 4 diesel submarines, 4 supply ships, and a landing ship tank, which has a ramp that can disgorge tanks onto a beach. Their land forces are smaller. I don't think it'll matter. Embarked on the battleship is 1 marine amphibious unit. I'll break these out later. They're in my notes, but it's not going to be critical unless we actually get to the point of a contested landing. Embarked in their landing ship tank, they have a company of light armored vehicles and an artillery battalion. Their air wing is, I would say, smaller but more potent. They have 8 F-14s. The F-14 is a long-legged aircraft with long-range missiles, very potent for this time period. They have 4 F-18s, which are able to do a great job of switch hitting between air-to-air and air-to-ground. They have two A4 Skyhawks, which are light attack aircraft. Then they have 6 AH-1 attack helicopters, 8 UH-1 utility helicopters. This combined makes up the air group for the battleship. Then they have 3 C-130s and 3 KC-130s. So a small air force, but they have a decent number of refuelers, which is actually going to give them, I think, a lot more operational flexibility than the Odontos Air Force has. But they're at a disadvantage that all of their forces are geographically all the way up here, which, let me pull out the ruler and refer you to the scale. 200 nautical miles an inch. We are about 825 nautical miles away, which means any of their aircraft that want to operate over the islands do need to hit a refueler on the way, and probably on the way back. Which is kind of why we're breaking things into those 6-hour turns. It'll just be easier to manage that, rather than try to continuously keep track of where exactly each refueler is on this map. Now, I know this is a lot to digest, especially if you're not familiar with a lot of these terms. We're probably going to do a full video just on all of the various vehicles and munitions to make sure everybody's up to speed and understands kind of the relative power here. Some things should be fairly obvious, like the force with 1 battleship and 3 cruisers is going to be more potent than the force with 1 battleship and 1 cruiser. But I did prepare something that I think may illustrate some of the power disparities and relationships. So, for missile warfare in the 1980s, we need to look at 2 things. What anti-ship missiles does each side have available, and in what quantities? And what surface-to-air missiles does each side have available to shoot down incoming anti-ship missiles? And I think this scenario has an interesting asymmetry here. So Odontos, let's run down the list. They have 4 heavy anti-ship missiles located on the island. They have 4 Harpoons, which is just about as standard as you can get for an anti-ship missile. Those are carried on board their Knox-class destroyer. And then they have 24 air-launched Harpoons that can be carried by various aircraft. On the other hand, Placata has 8 Harpoons on their 2 Knox-class ships, but only 4 Harpoons carryable by their aircraft. So, offensively, Odontos is going to have a much heavier punch, especially if they can coordinate so that their ships and aircraft are able to let off salvos at the same fleet at the same time. Now on the defensive side, Odontos has 9 of those Hawk missiles on the island. For their fleet, they have 24 Rim 7 Sea Sparrow missiles. This is a very short-range missile, about 10 miles, kind of a last-ditch defense thing. Oh, their helicopter ship has some of those as well. But we come over to the other side, we see that Placata has an almost equal amount of those little short-range Sea Sparrows. They have 32 medium-range standard missile ones. These have a range of, I think, 25 nautical miles. And then they have 46 of the Rim 8 Talos missiles. These are big, bads, from the early days of the Cold War. The Seekers aren't the greatest, but they have a massive ramjet, a massive warhead, and a nominal range of around 80 miles. Both forces have Stingers available, both for their ground troops and refit to some of the older destroyers and able to give them a chance to stand up in a modern air threat environment. So, Odontos absolutely holds the lead in anti-ship offense. Placata absolutely holds the lead in defense. We will just have to see exactly how it plays out. And there you have it. We are going to be playing King of the Hill in the East Pacific using the Harpoon V rules set. We'll sling $1 million missiles at $50 million aircraft in order to prevent them from blowing up $500 million ships. We'll keep rigorous account of all of it to see who balks, who carries through, and who gets to vacation in the Galapagos without having to get a passport. I hope you enjoyed this video. Next video is going to be 100% an equipment review. I'll try to include lots of photos for those of you who are not familiar with this era or with military equipment in general. I hope you're all looking forward to that, and I'll see you next time.